Understand.
The Republican Party
is out there. It can't be bargained with. It can't be reasoned with. It doesn't feel pity or remorse or fear. And it absolutely will not stop. Ever. Until you are dead.
During Obama's presidency, the House voted to repeal or amend the Affordable Care Act more than 50 times since it was passed in October 2009. But now that they essentially took control of the entire government in the 2016 elections, they've barely been able to get Trump care off the ground. That hasn't stopped them from trying, though. A lot. This week, probably by the time we release this episode, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, Republican, of course, Kentucky, will have pushed again for a Senate vote on Trump care. Except no one seems clear which version they'll be voting on, or if they're voting to just repeal Obamacare without even bothering to replace it. At the end of the day, whatever version passes, there are a few probable consequences. 1. People will lose health coverage. Statistically speaking, it will most likely be the at-risk populations like children, the elderly, the poor, people with special needs. You know, the people relying on that coverage to stay alive. Which leads to 2. Another possibility that some of those people are gonna just die. 3. A bunch of people who never have to worry about healthcare will get tax cuts. 4. Once the insurance market uncertainty levels off after the turbulence caused by Trump's erratic behavior and Congress's inability to pass anything meaningful, they'll start making money and probably cover less of their expensive customers if they don't have a government gun to their heads. 5. Some of those people will probably die. 6. Women who rely on their coverage to pay for contraception, annual exams, cancer screening and treatment may find themselves with none of those things. 7. Some of them will probably die. When I chose the, albeit edited, clip at the beginning of the Broadside, I was flippantly making a connection between a soulless, ruthless, relentless killing machine and the Terminator. The Republican Party, the GOP, the party that fancies itself pro-life, has become a tax-funded 21st century murder machine. The wars in Afghanistan and Iraq have bled across borders in the Middle East, so aside from the casualties directly caused by U.S. military operations, we have no end of refugees dying while fleeing their unstable and bomb-blasted homelands. Their continued insistence on prosecuting a war on drugs, which Jeff Sessions has made noises about escalating, has cost untold lives, ranging from the dealers whose deaths are gleefully cheered, to the innocents caught in crossfire, to addicts who go untreated because it's a moral failing to use drugs, but apparently not to consume alcohol or tobacco. Their insistence on abstinence-only sexual education has helped spread disease and increase unplanned pregnancies, some of which have ended in abortions, by ensuring that American youth remain uneducated about their bodies. They do this in conjunction with applying every legal maneuver possible to outlaw abortion, which usually just means targeting Planned Parenthood, thus ensuring an increase in the aforementioned pregnancies, STIs, and teen parents on welfare because of reduced access to clinical information, contraception, and health screenings. Speaking of welfare, the Republican Party has been a huge proponent of getting, quote, welfare queens off the public tit and working minimum wage jobs to reduce the drain on our budget, as long as those welfare queens aren't corporations that are getting tax cuts and government handouts. Now that I've mentioned corporations, let's not forget the Republican cries to free businesses from those job-killing regulations, like those silly work safety rules that prevent employee killing, the product safety rules that prevent child killing, and the environmental ones that prevent water and air poisoning. And while we're on the subject of the environment, let's remember they're the party of climate change denial and fossil fuel company fellatio. So the world may eventually look like the blistered outback of a Mad Max sequel, but with all the other shit listed above, most of us will probably already be dead by that point. And that's just a handful of the general party policies. I'm not even going to get into Trump's specific things, like his method of pissing off our allies, tweeting inflammatory shit about a nuclear-armed dictator, and his cozy romantic relationship with, well, a nuclear-armed dictator. Look, for fuck's sake, whether by accident or design, the modern Republican Party has finally reached the point with the election of Donald Trump and the drive to pass a wealth care bill. They've stopped pretending they give a single fuck about anyone but themselves and their bank accounts. But it still hasn't sunk in. Trump's approval rating, somewhere in the mid-30s, depending on the polling agency, is the lowest of any president in 70 fucking years. But in counties he won in the 2016 election, he still has a 50% approval rating. 50 fucking percent. How is that number not near zero everywhere?
How stupid are the people of the country to believe this crap?
I recognize that none of this shit is news to our audience. In 23 episodes, hundreds of Facebook posts and tweets, and a handful of written blog posts, we've touched each of these things and more. But I cannot adequately stress to you how much we need to get this message across to Republicans. Their continued support of the Republican Party makes them accomplices. While we recognize large corporate donors have wrested control of Republican policy from the party itself, Republicans can't keep getting voted into positions of power if people don't vote for them. If people can recognize that voting Republican is not only against their best interests, it may actually kill people they know and love. If they can understand that progressive ideas and policies aren't going to destroy America but can actually make their lives better, then maybe the bloodthirsty Republican Party can finally do the honorable thing and kill itself.
The sleep of reason brings forth monsters.
I'm a whiner, and I keep whining and whining until I win.
Maybe somebody will rise up.
We must not confuse dissent with disloyalty.
Welcome to Swing State, an aggressive, progressive, critical, and political podcast from the middle of the Midwest.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Swing State. Thank you so much for tuning in today. Not really much has been going on since last time. You know, it's just been, I don't know, I found pretty much like a kind of a wasteland of information.
Yeah, it's been completely dead this entire time.
Dead. You know, I woke up the other day and the president's, apparently looking into his pardoning power and the extent of that. Probably no big deal, right?
Yeah, I can't imagine why he'd have any interest in that. I mean, it's not like he's doing anything wrong or anything. Jesus fucking Christ. I'm not sure what bothers me the most. The fact that he's actually looking into whether or not he can pardon himself from a legal standpoint because he thinks he's going to need it, or that he's dumb enough that it would even occur to him that that would be something that might be a thing. Constitution or not, just from a common sense standpoint, I don't understand how the fuck anybody would think that's really a thing.
It would be insane. I mean, imagine a system in which the most powerful person of all of the positions that there are in the government, the most powerful among them, has the ability to basically expunge his own crimes. So he can do anything and then write a pardon for it for himself. I mean, can he do it more than once? Presumably he could get away with this indefinitely. Well, if you can pardon any crime and you can pardon anyone who's associated with you who is also helping you with the crime, that basically makes you a dictator.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't know how that doesn't essentially engender tyranny. I mean, do you think somebody like Putin has to have a conversation with somebody about whether or not he can pardon anybody? No, because he just does whatever the fuck he wants.
No, not anymore.
The fact that he was even looking just sort of floored me.
Aside from the common law defense, which is, you can't be the judge in your own case, the idea that the founding fathers, who just broke from monarchy, where essentially, I mean, that's what you're talking about. The king has unlimited power because there's no checks on the law on his power. I mean, of course, England wasn't exactly like that. But anyway, the idea that they would then use our system and the Constitution to actually give that kind of power to somebody, and that this would even be believed by anyone in the country for 10 seconds is amazing to me.
Richard Nixon gets kicked around a lot when we talk about this stuff now because it's the quickest, easiest comparison. But do you not think that if that were an option, that he wouldn't have been the first guy to be like, yeah, I'll fucking do that? Smarter people than him have been in worse situations and have not magically been able to pardon themselves. I mean, he had the next best thing in as vice president. But I mean, he also wasn't convicted of a bunch of shit.
Well, but it's just like the idea that we've had all of these presidents and that no one historically, it didn't occur to any of our historical figures that, actually I can just do anything I want and then I can write a little piece of paper that says, yeah, no, I'm forgiven, it's fine. I can't believe anyone swallows that.
Because I think we can all agree there has literally never been a president like Donald Trump.
No.
Take that however you want.
to just jump on that point about we've never had a president like Donald Trump, the thing that actually kind of unnerves me about this situation is imagine if he was more like the caricature villains who are both ruthless and cunning at the same time, like for real. Not they think they're cunning, but they're actually moronic. If you had a party that would protect somebody like that, like the Republicans have basically enabled Trump this entire way.
Yeah, could you imagine if he was smart?
But yeah, exactly. Imagine if he were smart. We will be lucky to get out of this with our democracy, as it is.
It's kind of unnerving that the thing that's basically saving our democracy is the same thing that sort of put it at risk, which is fucking stupidity. The only reason he's not more dangerous is because he's too stupid to know what he can do and not do, and to actually have any plan.
Yeah, it's like the only thing that's keeping us from the apocalyptic scenario where we're slowly turning into a country like Russia because we have a Putin-type figure instead of a Trump.
Yeah, speaking of crafty and evil, we're going to spend a lot of time this episode breaking down Trump's cozy relationship with Russia.
The article is published in the New Republic. It's called Trump's Russian Laundromat, and I have to give a shout-out to Cenk Unger at the Young Turks for turning me onto this one. It's from July 13th. I don't know how I missed this one for a week, but I finally found the article, and I think Lewayne and I've read through it at least twice. As much as is going on, I don't really want to talk about Jeff Sessions or even the pardoning stuff because that's all theoretical, because right here in this article is basically, it's like, you know how we had the skeleton of the connection between Trump and Russia for the collusion story once Donald Trump released the emails? Well, this is like the skeleton with quite a bit of muscle tone now on the money laundering aspect, which is, as Lewayne and I have been saying, it's probably the least understood but most important aspect of the investigation, because financial crimes can get you into some serious hot water. And when you're dealing with people like Trump is dealing with, you open yourself up to some very exotic types of prosecution thanks to the RICO statutes.
From the beginning, I'm not going to lie, the fucking title and subtitle killed me when I first saw this. Trump's Russian Laundromat. How to use Trump Tower and other luxury high-rises to clean dirty money, run an international crime syndicate, and propel a failed real estate developer into the White House, by Craig Unger. That is the tightest summation of a very complex issue ever.
That's a beautiful summary.
You almost don't know where to begin with something like this.
We'll walk you through quite a few of the highlights, but please do yourself a favor. Check out this article in its entirety.
We'll include a link in the show notes.
What we're going to do is we're going to tell you the story of Donald Trump again, but we're going to fill in a lot of the details that he doesn't want to reveal because he doesn't give out his tax returns. So you're no longer going to be left to his word to understand where his money comes from. This story is going to give you a much clearer picture of why Donald Trump is who he is.
So the article begins way back in 1984 with a Russian emigre named David Bogatin, who, according to the story, arrived in America with like $3 in his pocket. One of the interesting notes here, he was a former pilot for the Soviet Army whose specialty had been shooting down Americans over North Vietnam, and apparently had managed somehow with that $3 in his pocket to suddenly show up at the Trump Tower and drop $6 million on, as the article puts it, not one or two, but 5 luxury condos in Trump Tower. Trump apparently personally attended that closing. That sounds suspicious.
And the article kind of gives us some background about where this is headed. If the transaction seems suspicious, multiple apartments for a single buyer who appeared to have no legitimate way to put his hands on that much money, there may have been a reason. At the time, Russian mobsters were beginning to invest in high-end real estate, which offered an ideal vehicle to launder money from their criminal enterprises. Quote, during the 80s and 90s, we in the U.S. government repeatedly saw a pattern by which criminals would use condos and high-rises to launder money, says Jonathan Weiner, a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for International Law Enforcement in the Clinton administration. It didn't matter that you paid too much, because the real estate values would rise, and it was a way of turning dirty money into clean money, end quote. Right there in a nutshell, when we're talking about money laundering, specifically what do we mean by money laundering? We mean Trump was propositioned by foreign investors, specifically from Russia, to put money into condos at exorbitant rates because the rates would rise because it's Manhattan real estate, et cetera, and then their blood money would be washed clean thanks to the investment.
Right, because you either use the property or eventually flip the property and take that money and do something else with it. A little further down, it talks about, at the time that all this happened, that Trump Tower was only the second high-rise in New York that accepted anonymous buyers. They don't even know who the fuck is buying their properties.
Yeah.
They're just happy to take the money.
Cenk made this point on the Young Turks, and Cenk is a businessman. If you're an open and honest businessman, you don't have any problem putting your name to paper. It's only when you're dealing with corruption and potentially even darker shit than that that you're not willing to let anyone know who's buying your stuff when we're talking about millions of dollars.
Yeah, we're not talking about a shady deal on a car or a gun. We're talking about multiple properties. Speaking of which, a few years later, Bogatin gets bagged for a massive, as they put it, gasoline bootlegging scheme. He flees the country, the government seizes his assets, because that's what they did in the 80s when they thought you were a criminal. Note, I said thought, not convicted. When you're suspected of being a criminal. They seized his 5 condos, saying that he had purchased them, quote, to launder money to shelter and hide assets, end quote. A Senate investigation revealed that Bogatin, the guy we were talking about, was a fucking leading figure in the Russian mob in New York. And it then links more of his connections. I'm going to take a brief aside here. This is something AJ and I were talking about before. In the 80s, particularly because of the drug war, there's this whole asset forfeiture thing, where if you were suspected of being a criminal, not convicted, that's a point I'm going to make more than once probably, suspected, they would seize your assets and freeze your accounts. Now, as we outlined the stuff in this article, I want you to keep that in mind, that the government has had no problem suspecting a drug dealer and seizing his shit, or suspecting questionable businessmen and seizing their shit. And yet somehow, for 30 years, Trump has never had this issue. He still doesn't have this issue. This goes back to what we talked about before with the But Hillary shit. If this were any low-level guy, if it was some other Goomba, if it was somebody who wasn't a brand name, he probably would already have had all his shit frozen and seized.
Even crazier, because the article goes on to say that the very nature of Trump's businesses, all of which are privately held, makes it difficult to root out the truth about his financial deals. And the world of Russian oligarchs and organized crime by design is shadowy and labyrinthine. We're just getting started with the specifics. But I just want everyone to have a clear point in your mind here about who we're talking about and the types of deal we're talking about and the amount of money that we're talking about just in the first, 10 paragraphs of this. We've already got a pattern that, by what Lewayne is saying, you would think that if anyone was going to be stripped of everything, if you appeared to be a criminal assisting or profiting from, whichever, the Russian mafia, why are you not the one being targeted?
Yeah, particularly because his own AG, Jeff Sessions, has been making noises about enforcing more of that asset forfeiture shit. Because he's just gung-ho for them marijuanas, of all fucking things. They have, the greatest example of criminal activity. Fucking organized racketeering right here in front of them. Not a big. The public record alone, no investigation necessary, reveals a pattern of business connections with Russia.
The article says over the past 3 decades, at least 13 people with known or alleged links to Russian mobsters or oligarchs have owned, lived in, and even run criminal activities out of Trump Tower and other Trump properties. One of the most famous examples was the poker game that was broken up on the floor directly beneath Donald Trump, connected to high-level Russian mafia figures who we're going to be introduced to pretty soon. And then one final piece of context, never forget, in 2008, Donald Trump Jr. is on camera saying that a disproportionate cross-section of our assets come from Russia. We have a lot of money pouring in from Russia. So any idea that Trump tries to spin this as, I don't know any Russians, what are you talking about? I've never met a Russian in my life. I have no deals in Russia. I maybe sold a house to a Russian once. That is all grade A, pure A bullshit.
Yeah, because in The Art of the Deal, he talks about a trip to what was still the Soviet Union at the time. And, as he put it, one thing led to another, and now I'm talking about building a large luxury hotel across the street from the Kremlin in partnership with the Soviet government. But he's never done any deals with the Russians. Which is kind of true in that, according to this, he and the boys have tried and failed 5 times to build a Trump Tower in Moscow. But I think if you look at how this is set up, the reason for that is simple. The Russians want to keep all that shit over here.
Yeah, no, the Russians don't want him to profit in Russia. They want to profit off of him. And, he'll make some money in the process, but he's just a useful patsy. And the article does say, it's important to note this, it's entirely possible that Trump was never more than a convenient patsy for Russian oligarchs and mobsters, with his casinos and condos providing easy pass-throughs for their illicit riches. At the very least, with his constant need for new infusions of cash and his well-documented troubles with creditors, Trump made an easy, quote, mark for anyone looking to launder money. And this is an important point, that the timeline of Trump's business career. Remember the 5 bankruptcies everybody was talking about during the campaign? Well, that was actually real, and the biggest slope in his business career happened when his Atlantic City casinos crashed.
Actually, it sort of made me laugh the first time I read it, because all I keep hearing from Trump supporters is what a great businessman he is, and if he just runs the government like a business, everything will be great. But to quote the article, quote, throughout the 1990s, untold millions from the former Soviet Union flowed into Trump's luxury developments in Atlantic City casinos. But all that money wasn't enough to save Trump from his own failings as a businessman, end quote. He owed something like $4 billion to over 70 banks, and he basically spent most of the 90s in lawsuits and bankruptcy courts and just trying not to completely lose all of his shit.
$800 million of that was personally guaranteed debt.
How the fuck does anybody do that? I mean, like, how does anybody say, yeah, I'll totally lend you $800 million worth of shit based on your say-so?
Somebody smarter than me said economics is a dismal science or whatever, but I am struggling in my head to figure out how you can personally guarantee $800 million worth of debt. You can owe $4 billion to 70 banks. You can fail, and then you're still allowed to keep your tower. You still ride around in limos. You're riding first class in airplanes. You have your own airplane. There's something about the way the country works here economically that seems to be toxically wrong, if this is even possible.
Aside from the fact that the American economic system seems sort of weighted to help out guys like Trump, he was further assisted by the fact that the Russian economy was collapsing at about the same time his business empire was collapsing, and all the Russian mobsters needed somewhere to put their money. And lo and behold, here's a guy who needs a shit ton of money.
Working in the real estate sector, which is one of the lesser regulated sectors of the economy. And suddenly, Donald Trump is riding high, being paid way overpriced for properties, but he's also letting in some pretty bad hombres, as he might say.
What's interesting about all that, though, is the spin that Donald puts on all of that. He doesn't admit that essentially Russian mobsters saved his ass. Part of it is, I don't think he knows what the fuck he's doing. Part of it is, nobody can save Donald's ass except Donald. As far as Donald is concerned,
what he's telling people throughout the 2000s on The Apprentice in the intro,
my name's Donald Trump, and I'm the largest real estate developer in New York. I own buildings all over the place, model agencies, the Miss Universe pageant, jetliners, golf courses, casinos, and private resorts like Mar-a-Lago, one of the most spectacular estates anywhere in the world. But it wasn't always so easy. About 13 years ago, I was seriously in trouble. I was billions of dollars in debt. But I fought back, and I won. Big league. I used my brain, I used my negotiating skills, and I worked it all out. Now my company's bigger than it ever was, it's stronger than it ever was. I've mastered the art of the deal, and have turned the name Trump into the highest quality brand.
I know he's a fucking raging egomaniac, so the fact that he would spin all of it this way doesn't surprise me. But the part that sort of caught me off guard was, this article spends a lot of time trying to basically point out he may not know what he's doing. I mean, he may just be a patsy for these guys, and that's great. And it's certainly possible. I mean, he's dumb as a post, so he may have no idea what's going on. And we've learned over time, particularly as we watched his tweets, that you basically can't trust anything he says. But if you just take what he said a moment ago, he has essentially confessed to masterminding all of this shit.
Yeah, on top of the astounding arrogance and hubris and stupidity of the statement, because if you were any kind of legitimate businessman, you would not need Russian thieves who have basically plundered their own country and mafioso types. You used their blood money to rescue yourself, and you think that makes you a genius, rather than somebody who, I don't know, builds a legitimate business, who doesn't have to turn to the mafia and the easy money.
If you spend any time reading this article, which I really encourage you to do, because we're not remotely scratching the surface of what it covers, every other fucking paragraph is a list of another business person, another former Soviet attached to criminal organizations that he has done business with. I mean, there's the thing with Trump Soho, which was part of a deal with a couple of other development companies, Bayrock and Sapir. And Sapir, coincidentally, run by some former Soviets, they didn't even want Trump's money. They just wanted his name.
Yeah, just listen to this little piece here.
Now, I can understand why Trump would want to take this off. Quote, the developers would finance and build Trump Soho themselves. In return for lending his name to the project, Trump would get 18% of the profits without putting up any of his money, end quote. Now, as I said before, I could see why he would want to take a deal like that, because he sure fucking loves money and he doesn't have to put any up. But how do you not look at that and go, ooh, that
wait a
sounds
minute.
questionable?
You don't want me to put any money into the project. You don't want me to finance any aspect of the project. The only thing you want is my brand name, and I'm going to get nearly a fifth of the profits. What the hell kind of a business? I mean, I understand why somebody would want to take that deal, but how are you going to explain this one to the FBI? Especially when they have the other guys part of the conversation and their motivations probably as well.
The only thing I could think of is just ego. He really thinks his brand actually means something, and somebody would be willing to pay for it. I mean, I suppose maybe he thought of it, assuming he thought anything at all about it. Maybe he thought of it as like licensing something, putting your name on a poster or on a pair of shoes or whatever the fuck it is. But I can't even begin. I'm constantly frustrated going through this article, because maybe it's different when you are a wealthy business person, but I don't know how any of this stuff doesn't look a little suspicious to somebody who's even paying any attention at all.
Yeah, and like Lewayne said a moment ago, this story is a very long, deep dive. And we're just sort of skimming through a couple of the highlights because, like he said, there is business after business after business after deal after business after deal that are all this way. You know, as the article says, that all of Trump's businesses sort of follow this pattern. They are all done in very shadowy, secretive ways, and you keep running across ex-Soviets and mobster figures and oligarchs, and Donald Trump is very happy about that fact. And in fact, at one point in the article, he's put in a room with basically all of the oligarchs around the time of the Miss Universe pageant in Moscow. And he was so happy to see that everyone had come out to see him.
He actually is quoted as saying, quote, almost all of the oligarchs were in the room, end quote. And this is a quote in Real Estate Weekly. We're not talking about some trippy liberal magazine. A lot of this information that's quoted comes from things like Forbes and Financial Times, organizations that know about money. And that even they're like, what the fuck? Trump himself can't even keep his story straight when it comes to how he does business with the Russians. 1 minute, he doesn't know any Russians. He doesn't have any business with any Russians. He doesn't know how they would have any leverage over him at all, because he doesn't go to Russia. He doesn't do business in Russia. He has no loans with Russia. Well, maybe it's true. Maybe he doesn't have any loans. They just bought a bunch of his shit. But then he would turn around, like in his interview with Lester Holt, and say, oh, yeah, I've had dealings over the years with plenty of Russians. This wealthy dude, and I had the pageant there, and all. I mean, he can't keep the story straight. And I don't even know that he's deliberately doing it. I think he's just literally stupid. I don't think he has any idea what he's doing.
Yeah, the cover-up aspect is pretty sad.
I know that there has to be a point where the current Republican Party has to be, like, absolutely regretting doing business with Trump. I mean,
they've probably been there since the beginning, since he won the nomination, yeah.
But
which begs the question, why the hell didn't we know some of this information?
Right.
Because like Lewayne said, this is not some, alternate daily whatever. This is Financial Times. This is Forbes. This is open information that we should have had access to months and months and months ago. How nobody found out about the connections.
Particularly given that it was clear most of the way through the campaign, Republicans didn't want him. I mean, does this go back to the whole party loyalty thing? Because if you want to get rid of a guy like Trump and you're the Republicans and you know any of this stuff, and you have to know, somebody in the fucking Republican Senate reads a Forbes magazine every now and again. They could have gotten rid of him. Just leak this shit. They know that the fucking mouth breathers that vote for them just need suspicion. They don't need conviction. If they're going to rail against Hillary for her fucking emails, what do you think's going to happen when there's a leak that reveals that Donald Trump has colluded with the Russians, that has business with the Russians, that has done business deals with guys who've been arrested for fucking child prostitution? You tell me that you couldn't get rid of him as Republicans?
And that you'd be willing to carry that bucket of water a single step further is... We're reaching the point of unforgivability just for anyone who's even associated with anything that's going on right now in Republican politics, because I'm still not hearing the outspoken voices saying, holy shit, it appears that we've got a giant money laundering racket being run by the president. And the most terrifying thing of all, of course, ladies and gentlemen, is he's sitting in the White House today. These connections haven't gone away. And that's the whole point of the article, is that this stuff goes back to the 1980s. Donald Trump didn't just get mixed up with the Russians in the middle 2000s with the Moscow pageant or earlier than that.
His career has been built on this.
Without the Russian mafia, the article concludes, there would not be a President Trump. He just wouldn't exist because they wouldn't have had the comeback. He would have just been the broke-ass billionaire who owed $4 billion to 70 banks and couldn't get himself out.
And instead, he's sitting in the fucking Oval Office.
Yeah.
And he's doing everything he can, intentionally or not, to completely fuck this country.
Well, and it looks pretty obvious at this point, because when he meets Putin, then he has another meeting with Putin, trying to signal to him at the table at the dinner that they were having at the G20, and goes and talks to him one-on-one. They immediately started talking about easing the sanctions related to Crimea as soon as, even before he got into office, and then during the transition and after. That's what busted Flynn. Everything that he's done makes total sense if you just think, man, he's just kind of a Russian asset. They've got leverage on him. He's going to do what he has to do to keep Vlad happy. And the story just click. Oh, that's it. Everything makes sense. His behavior makes sense. His fear makes sense. The fact that he doesn't want to release his tax returns to let anyone know where his money actually comes from makes sense, because the answers are all sitting in plain sight right there. They're right there in the article.
They are. They're all out. And like you said, this is a history that goes back 30-odd years, but it's still going on. It's not just history. It's not like he did a dirty deal 30 years ago and now he's managed to somehow still bootstrap his way into the White House. He's still doing this. One of the few policy things he ever had directly in mind was sanctions on Russia.
Yeah, relieving sanctions, trying to get them some compounds back here in the States, trying to clear visas for people coming from Russia to the United States. Now we have this joke of a cybersecurity pact that we talked about last time. Guys, this is terrifying. This is like the Manchurian Candidate. You've got a guy who is loyal to Russia and Vladimir Putin in the White House today.
You've got a guy who shows no loyalty to anyone else, not to his children, not to the people who work for him, but he shows loyalty to Vladimir Putin, a dictatorial, authoritarian leader of what is essentially an enemy nation.
Yeah, a mafia state interfering in governments and democracies throughout the world.
That's who he shows loyalty to.
Unwavering loyalty. You cannot get him to say a bad thing about them. If you say Putin's a murderer, has journalists killed, well, there's a lot of killers. That is how far he will go to protect Vladimir Putin in speech, let alone what is he willing to do at the behest of Vladimir Putin, at the suggestion of Vladimir Putin, or anyone connected to that government, who we know they have been in constant contact with from last June to probably the present day.
How much more does anyone need?
Right. I mean, at this point, you should just be feeling pretty damn patriotic if you're listening to us, going, what the hell, man? Martha, get my gun. Like, it's time to get these people out.
But that's just it. Right now, the Republicans basically control everything, right? They're in a position to fix this fucking problem themselves, but they're not working real hard at it. The most that I've seen is the bill basically meant to stop Trump from making unilateral decisions with regard to Russia. Well, why would you need to do that unless you know he's going to do something like that?
Yeah, that's also interesting. Yeah, the very fact that you have to put that bill forward, that almost is like, that's evidence of knowledge.
Right.
That's evidence of understanding of what's going on and your responsibilities, which then begs the question, why is that all you're doing? If you think the man can't be trusted to handle the Russian sanctions thing because he's compromised, then what in the world are you doing? What are we doing? What are we even talking about?
That's the thing that I find the most frustrating. They obviously didn't want him in the position to begin with. They have a way to get him out of this position. All they have to do is turn on him, which is what we said I don't know how long ago. I know I directly spoke to Trump supporters. Look, it's okay. Right? It's fine. You made a mistake. People do it all the time. Rectify that fucking mistake. And instead, we're still going forward. I don't know how much of this is just McConnell, but we're still going to try and go forward with the welfare bill.
Yeah.
Some version of it. I don't know. Instead of worrying about your fucking wallets, maybe get him the fuck out and then see what you can do. Maybe just this one time these guys can fucking put the country first.
You know, at this point, I'm pretty jaded with the idea of Republican conservatism. It doesn't seem to me that there's much of a moral space left where that would happen. I mean, you know, it just doesn't seem likely. I don't know what they're waiting for. I don't know what it's going to take for them to figure out that, hey, we have a job to do here because we took an oath to protect the Constitution, and there's somebody that is clearly trying to destroy it. And I can understand Trump voters. You know, I didn't know all this information the whole time.
No.
I mean, I've had inklings of some of it for a while, but now that the reporting has caught up from various outlets, the details are being filled out day after day after day. The drip drip, as everyone keeps saying. And I'm sure that there's more and worse yet to come. But just sitting where we are today, in the year of our Lord 2017, I don't know what more you would need to figure out that, oh, this is clearly suspicious, to the point of alarming, to the point of we need to get him out of here, just because the thought of this continuing for another 6 months, a year, whatever.
I just don't understand how standard human self-preservation isn't enough. What are you trying to protect? The party? It's clear that the people voting for you don't give a shit about anything you actually do. They'll still suck your dick regardless of what scandal happens. So it's not consistency in position. It's not, oh, we're going to look stupid because we backed him and then he turned on us. Nobody gives a shit. The Republican Party is grossly inconsistent most of the time in its moral positions. So you just do it again. I mean, you guys they're the fucking masters of spinning the fact that they switched positions as a good thing.
Yeah, that's part of their basic political calculation. And considering that, what do you think that you're going to get out of Donald Trump? Because I think Russia maybe even had some high-minded ideas of what they were going to get out of Donald Trump, and that's just kind of like the Shakespearean character he is. I even imagine that at a certain point, some people who were involved in the intelligence aspect of collusion, and maybe Putin himself, were thinking, yeah, we're probably going to get some sanctions relief. We might actually get a few concessions out of this, but the guy is so fucking clueless and bumbling and obvious. Republicans learn the lessons of history.
Every enterprise he touches is ruined. Think about that. You gave him the United States as a business to run. Look how well that's worked.
Look at how he's running it. Look at the state of the White House, the unfilled positions across the country in the judiciary, the cabinet clusterfuck, you name it.
Let's go back to that. Let's use that whole business model again. Let's say that the U.S. government is a business, and he's a, quote, successful businessman. But if you look, the only reason his businesses have survived is because of Russian interference and Russian investment. Is that the business you want the U.S. to become?
You have a guy who inherits a bunch of money, an asshole, a blowhard. He turns it into some failed businesses and casinos, and he then gets bailed out by the mafia and thinks he's a genius.
And worse, other people think he's a genius.
Yeah, and then other people are willing to tolerate it. I mean, this is something that Sam Harris kind of made this point on his podcast. He was interviewing Scott Adams, and he was saying that there is nothing about Trump that I can believe. Like, when I see the guy, it's just an instant reaction, like, oh my God, he's a bullshit artist. I mean, it's just the most visceral, emotional reaction that you get to a person, and yet there is still, to this day, a segment of the population that they can't see that. Just can't see it. And it is mystifying. It's also scary because it just shows you, like we were saying earlier, imagine if Trump were clever. Imagine if he were actually one of like the boss of bosses in Russia, as they mentioned in the article.
Imagine if he just were the supervillain that he seems to be. That he were not only dangerous, but smart. The problem is the guy running him is dangerous and smart. And he's in another fucking country where it's kind of hard to get to him.
And who knows what Putin would tell Trump to do in this situation if he's seeking his advice. Vlad, how the hell do I get out of all this reporting? What do I do?
You kill them. You kill the reporters. That's how you do it.
Well, you bomb the New York Times and Washington Post. They will respect you then.
That would be funny if it weren't sort of frightening.
I have almost like a kind of cognitive dissonance going on in me. On the one hand, I feel as though we very narrowly missed like a dagger, like it thunked into the board next to us. But at the same time, this shit isn't over. We haven't escaped anything. Like, we're still waiting for the end game to play out. I don't know how this is going to go. I don't know. We know that right now Donald Trump is conspiring to figure out how he can get rid of Jeff Sessions. And this is turning out to be one of the funnier little operatic sagas in this thing, where any self-respecting person would have resigned after being lambasted repeatedly by your employer in public. But he hasn't, which makes me wonder, I don't know, is Mueller telling him to do that? Has he figured that out on his own? Is he like, fuck Trump? I don't know, who even knows what the motivation is there.
Who knows? Maybe Mueller went to Sessions and said, okay, here's the deal. I'm going to be lenient on you, but I need some shit.
He's trying to fire Sessions because then he can get somebody in there to fire Mueller. He's basically openly contemplating further obstruction of justice.
Openly.
Yes, openly. And by the way, I think that in the end, a lot of his tweets and public statements will fall into the category of evidence of obstruction of justice, and that could eventually be what he's impeached on, at least partially. We're watching all this happen in real time, and it is kind of surreal. It's like it's happening somewhere else far away, but no, this is all our country. This is what our government looks like in 2017, and we're in a pretty scary place.
So thanks, Republicans. We appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you.
So on that happy note, I think we're going to go ahead and wrap it up.
Thank you to Craig Unger, who wrote Trump's Russian Laundromat, How to Use Trump Tower and Other Luxury High-Rises to Clean Dirty Money, Run an International Crime Syndicate, and Propel a Failed Real Estate Developer into the White House. Truly an inspiring piece.
And a blueprint for Robert Mueller to use.
Yeah, if Mueller didn't already know all this, hint, hint, he does, this would be a great place to start. But for the common person out there who's just kind of like, you're wondering, why is everyone talking about the mafia? Why is everyone talking about Trump Russia? This will lay it out for you in about as stark a terms as you could ask for. And as the information from the investigation begins to become public here in the coming months and years, or however the fuck long it takes, remember this article. Remember this article. I believe we will all be looking back at it with a smile.
So, for the time being, do everything you can to remind your elected representatives what a fucking dumpster fire sits in the Oval Office right now, and how they basically need to do everything they can to stop him from doing more harm to the country. So, as always, organize, mobilize, protest,
vote.